This is a 1997 Citroen Xantia, and it's weird. It's like a normal 1990s mid-size sedan, except much, much weirder because it's French, and all the French know how to do is weird. Today, I'm going to review the Xantia and show you all of its many quirks and features. Before I get started, great news! This Citroen Xantia is currently for sale, and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. If you've ever wanted something a little, well, different, this is certainly that, and it's available with no reserve, and it's titled and registered here in the United States. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this crazy Citroen, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the rather quirky Citroen Xantia, and I'm going to start with a little overview. So, the Xantia was sold from 1992 through 2002, so it was basically Citroen's mid-size sedan throughout the 1990s until it was replaced in the early 2000s by the Citroen C5. Now, the Xantia itself had replaced the Citroen BX, which was their very popular mid-size sedan throughout the 1980s. So, while the BX was the mid-size Citroen that everybody had in the 80s, the Xantia was the one that everybody had in the 90s, and I mean everyone. Citroen built 1.2 million of these during this car's lifespan, which is a huge number for a car that was mostly only popular in France. Now, around the time that this car came out, Citroen had released a smaller entry-level model called the ZX, which had been criticized for being a bit too mainstream, a bit too normal, not quite French enough. And so with the Xantia, Citroen certainly remedied that reputation. So let's talk through the many quirks and features of the Xantia, starting with, well, starting it. You go to start the car, you stick the key and you twist it, and you'll notice it just cranks. Take a listen. So you're thinking, well, this car's broken, it doesn't start. No, that was intentional. In order to start the Xantia, you didn't just stick in the key and twist it, you had to enter a secret code. There is a little number pad next to the gear lever in the center console. You can see there's a light that's blinking red right now. That means the code hasn't been entered. You enter the secret code, in this car's case 1973, and then the light turns green, and then you can start the car right up. Take a listen. Yes, that's right. You had to enter a passcode to get the car started, and that's just the beginning of the weirdness in the Xantia. Moving down the center console, you see this lever on a long track here in the middle with some lines next to it, and at the top there's like a half circle, and at the bottom there's like a full circle. This adjusts the suspension, and if you move this lever to the top position, it puts the car all the way down. That half circle is intended to represent sort of the wheel arches covering up the wheels. You can see the car going lower and lower and into its low position. You would use this setting if, for example, you're trying to do top speed, maximize your aerodynamics in your Xantia. If you move the lever in the other direction, it goes all the way high. This circle is intended to represent the wheels with the body raised above them. And when the car is in its highest possible setting, well, as you can see, it is quite high. Now, this suspension is hydroneumatic, which is complicated to explain, but basically it uses hydraulics and gas in order to, well, as you can see, lift the car or drop it down at will. That's one of the benefits. Years earlier, Citroen had basically invented this technology because the roads in post-war France were not that great, and sometimes you needed to lift up the car car in order to get down a road. And so this was their solution, and it became a well-known Citroen thing, and it was on a lot of their models, including the Xantia. And that wasn't the only benefit of hydroneumatic suspension. It also led to excellent ride quality, and it could self-level, meaning you would stick a bunch of heavy stuff in the trunk, the cargo area. Normally the car would sag down. Not in this case. The suspension would raise up the rear to compensate and keep the car level regardless of where weight was distributed. Hydroneumatic suspension. And things get even stranger. Still here in the center console, this button with arrows and like some lines. The icon doesn't really make any sense, but this would turn on the active anti-roll bars that this car had. In the suspension, to prevent body roll, you could turn on anti-roll bars that would actively manage and keep the car completely level even when you were going hard around corners. That was one of the really big selling points of the Xantia with this feature called the Activa model, which this is. It stayed flat even under hard cornering, tight turning, whatever. The active anti-roll bars would do their thing. These days, active anti-roll bars become a common feature of high-end luxury cars, but back in the day, it was special and rare. Like I said, 1.2 million Xantias were built. Only 18,000 were Activa models like this one with the active anti-roll bar feature. But there's more weird beyond just some of the interesting features that Citroen added to this car. The climate controls look fairly standard. Position the air, change the temperature, whatever, but the air conditioning button is located here, not next to the climate controls, instead next to the hazard lights and the clock in a completely different place. You also have odd placement of the window switches. The driver's door panel, you have the driver window and the passenger window, pretty standard. The rear windows are controlled with switches in the center console. Completely different spot from the front windows in the front of this car. Certainly a quirky decision. How about the fact that there's no dome light? You look on the ceiling, you can see no interior light that comes on like when you open the doors. Instead, it's located on the B pillar, and you have a B pillar dome light driver and passenger side in this car. So instead of one central dome light, you got two on either side. And that's in addition to the map light, which is also right in this vicinity on the ceiling above the door, driver and passenger side. You also had individual dome lights. And another interesting quirk, in the center you got two climate vents like most cars do. Strangely, on the driver's side you also have two climate vents, an upper and a lower one that you could point in different directions if for some reason that's what you want to do. It's especially weird because on the passenger side you don't have that, just one climate vent, but the driver got two distinct ones, which doesn't really make sense. And how's this for weird? Take a listen to the warning chime that warns you that you left your headlights on. When you've taken the key out, you're going to walk away. Here's the warning. That is certainly weird and certainly French. And on the subject of weird sounding things in this car, the horn is not in the center of the steering wheel where you would expect it. Instead, it's at the end of the turn signal stalk. You press this button on the end and that sounds the horn. This was a common placement of horns throughout the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s on some cars, but not in 1997. That is unusual, and so they did it because it is Citroen. You couldn't put the horn on the steering wheel, in fact, because the steering wheel was busy with other bizarre functions, like this button that says memo. I guess you could press it and record yourself a memo of you speaking if you wanted to. More interesting to me, though, is this button that says mute. The weird part is it's not one button, but two. Why would you need two mute functions? You want to mute, you mute. You want to unmute, you press the same button again. It's how it works at every other car, but here there's two buttons for that simple function. Now, unfortunately, the steering wheel audio controls do not control this aftermarket stereo, so we may never know why there are two buttons for mute. Mute and then really mute. And next up we move on to the back seat in the Xantia, which is pretty tight for a midsize sedan, you can see my knees are right up against the seat in front of me, my head is right up against the headliner, although frankly it's not that surprising. This is an older car, and cars used to be smaller. Even midsize sedans were kind of tight, and that's especially true in Europe, where their size classes are a little smaller than the ones in the States, so I wasn't expecting a large back seat. It's decent and about what you would have gotten on basically any other midsize sedan in Europe at the time. Now back here, surprisingly not much quirky going on. You have window controls mounted on the doors, as you can see, power window controls, even though you also had those window controls for the back windows on the front center console. So there's two rear window controls that are reachable to rear passengers. You also had an ashtray back here, because of course you did. It was the 90s in Europe and smoking was essentially mandatory. And also worth pointing out back here, a little storage pocket on the door panel, which isn't that quirky, but surprisingly uncommon. Even in modern cars, nice to see it back in the 90s, you could store your stuff even as a backseat passenger. And next we move under the hood in the Xantia, where you see one of this car's best features, the V6. A V6 was exceptionally rare in these. Citroen offered the Xantia with an enormous range of four-cylinder engines. There's dozens of them, 1.6 liter, 1.8 liter, turbocharged, non-turbo, diesel, naturally aspirated, many different engines and configurations, all four cylinders, ranging from about 70 horsepower up to 150, but there was only one V6, and that was this. It made about 190 horsepower, which doesn't seem like much, but that was a pretty healthy figure for a mid-size sedan at the time, especially in Europe. And this was the top of the range powertrain. Now, the owner of this car, the seller on Cars and Bids, tells me that the Xantia is fitted with a 19-gallon fuel tank. And so you figure 19-gallon tank, if it can do 25 miles per gallon, that's about a 475-mile driving range, which is quite impressive. And the owner says that if you're really light-footed, you could probably stretch it to 600 miles of driving range, which is an amazing figure and kind of ridiculous that this little vehicle had such a large fuel tank. You had to get across France without stopping. And next up we move on to the back of the Xantia, where you see a couple of Citroen hallmarks just looking at the car from the outside. Specifically, a short rear end design without a long trunk like a lot of sedans had in this era, and also a rear wheel arch that doesn't make a clean circle over the rear wheel. You can see it's kind of pushed down in comparison to the front wheel arch. Those were two common Citroen design traits. The wheel arch was just there for style. It was characteristic of Citroen, but the short rear end was functional because this car isn't actually a sedan, it's a hatchback. You open up this rear and it's a tailgate instead of a typical trunk like you would find in a sedan. Indeed, the Xantia was offered in two body styles. You could get this or you could get a station wagon. There was no true sedan with a trunk, which was pretty common in Europe for many years. Europeans always preferred hatchbacks. Americans preferred a true sedan with a trunk. So most European sedans, as we would know them, were actually hatchbacks, including the Xantia. Now, when you get into the back here, you can see the benefit of having a hatchback instead of a trunk. Specifically, you got a lot of space, and more than you'd have in a trunk, because of course you can stack things all the way to the rear window back here. You're not limited by a trunk lid, and you can fold down the back seats. And if you do that, then there's even more space with even more possibilities for sticking cargo in the back of your Xantia. None of that stuff is particularly unusual, especially as these hatchback sedans have kind of caught on to an extent in the States. Things like the BMW 3 Series Gran Turismo, the Kia Stinger, etc. But that's the situation back here. The quirkiest part in back is unquestionably the rear sunshade, which is mounted here on the cargo cover for the cargo area, which lifts up with the tailgate when you open it up. When the tailgate is down, that cargo cover is flat, and then you're sitting in the back seat, you can raise the rear sunshade and stick it into place. I have never before seen a rear sunshade mounted on a moving cargo cover, but that's what they've done here. It gives you the best of all worlds, a rear sunshade and a European-friendly hatchback. As for the name of this car, Xantia, which obviously is spelled with an X and is weird. It goes along with the rest of the weird stuff. This name is derived from Greek, Xanthos, which was the name of an ancient Greek city, and also a Greek word meaning like blonde or golden. It conjured up beauty, and so they altered it, turned it into Xantia, and that's how they named this car. It actually had some precedent because Citroen had previously used some Greek words in model names, I think, but especially trim level names, and so here they decided to do it again with Xantia, just contributing to the strangeness of this car. All right, driving the Citroen Xantia Activa. Now, this is the most desirable version of the Xantia. Activa with the flat cornering suspension, the V6, the manual transmission. The seller, the owner of this car, told me that of the 1.2 million Xantias they made, only a few hundred were the manual Activa with the V6. Like, this has it all. Now, Xantias aren't rare. You go to France, even today, you will still see a lot of Xantias rolling around. But this is the dream Xantia spec, if there ever was such a thing. And I gotta say, and I hate to admit this, because it's weird and French and 90s, this is actually a pretty good car. At least from a driving perspective. And I'll tell you the primary reason is the powertrain. That V6 is excellent. It's punchy and peppy in a way that you would never expect for a non-performance car. Like, it's got good mid-range, it's very smooth, like very smooth power delivery. It sounds okay, it drives okay. This is an excellent V6. And of course, with the manual transmission, you can really kind of get it into gear right, but you don't need to, because 4,000 RPM, you step on it, it delivers the power, and it delivers it smoothly. I'm truly impressed by the engine, but it isn't just that. This car is also like quite comfortable to drive around in. That was one of the advantages of the hydropneumatic suspension. A lot of people think that that was the only advantage, that a car with hydropneumatic suspension was simply more comfortable, but it had more than that, including the self-leveling and the raise and lower like I showed you. But in this case, this car is very comfortable, surprisingly so. And that ridiculous active anti-roll bar thing that keeps the car cornering flat, it works. Now, I want to be clear that the steering in this car is not at all quick. It's a 90s sedan kind of steering feel. So you kind of got to give it a second to do its thing. But once you do, it corners flat. There's no like annoying body roll. There's no like feelings of seasickness kind of cruising around like you might expect from hydropneumatic suspension. You might think there's a lot of give to keep the ride calm, and because you know there's a lot of suspension travel, but in fact, this car corners dead flat, and it feels surprisingly sporty as a result, especially when paired with the V6, which is spry. You also have a decent manual transmission in here. The clutch is okay, a little vaguer than you'd want, but the shift action is pretty nice, and I'm like astonished because so many of these were built. They were not special cars, but in the States they're unusual, and also just 25 years later you drive it, it is not so bad. In fact, it's quite good. I got in this car thinking, oh boy, here we go, a French car from the 90s is gonna be ridiculous. And now I'm driving it, I'm like totally astonished by how good it is. It really drives like a modern car, at least from a powertrain and comfortability and steering and handling perspective. It really is better than you would think. Now, before I get everybody's hopes up, I do want to make the point, the obvious point here, which is, you know, owning and operating this car is probably not the greatest thing in the world. In France, I'm sure these are starting to get difficult to own with hydropneumatic stuff and parts becoming harder to find. Here in the States, it's even harder, I have no doubt. But I'm sitting here and like the air conditioning is blowing cold. I got decent interior room in here. It's really not so bad. The seat can go back far. I got like a nice amount of space. Overall, I don't know, this is a cool car. You know, I like the quirky stuff. And this car is certainly the quirky stuff. It's not going to be an expensive sale, I have no doubt, on Cars and Bids. And it's a lot cooler way to drive around. You'll turn heads at the local Cars and Coffee than so many other cars that cost 10 or even 100 times as much as this one. This is certainly a what is that type of car, especially for car enthusiasts. You know, how did you get that Citroen here? What the hell? Show me the weird features. And then you bust out the suspension raising and people think it's like a budget 959. And so that's the 1997 Citroen Xantia Activa V6, the thinking man's Xantia. Or something. This is a shockingly good car, especially to drive. I'm legitimately surprised by it, and of course, I love all the quirks. And now it's time to give this Citroen a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 42 out of 100, which places the Xantia here against rivals. This is a quirky and weird car that would turn heads at Cars and Coffee, and it's shockingly nice to drive with a smooth V6 and a good manual transmission. But it's surely challenging to own as it ages, especially in America. Still, it's way cooler than anything else you can get at this price point, and I'm thrilled I had the chance to review the Xantia. I always love a good weird French car video.